this computer. Okay, so what I'll do is give a brief sort of informal introduction to Zibby rather than give a more traditional bio, and then I'll just turn it over to them. Okay, so Zibby Jahns is a site-specific multimedia sculptor and performance artist. Their work explores layered histories of identity and the politics of place and invites active collaboration with viewers and participants. Their current work focuses on building performative sculptures that offer resources and solace for those who are grieving, as well as distilling the emotions of the grieving process. Zibby's past works weave history, material culture, visual display, and spectatorship to ponder the complexities of our past and envision utopic futures. And then on a personal note, I'll say that I really admire Zibby as someone whose work is intensely transdisciplinary and who works in a materially driven way and whose work is intensely committed to art as a social practice. Their work is rich and thoughtful and smart, and I think we're all really fortunate to hear from them today. So that being said, please welcome Zibby Jahns.
Thank you so much, Allie, for that beautiful welcome. I'm just going to get started. I wanted to say that I'll be giving this lecture, but I want to invite any questions that pop up along the way. Say you're curious about what something's made out of or want a little more information. Unfortunately, sometimes Zoom makes it so that when you're in presenter mode, it's hard to see when someone comments or raises their digital hand. If you really want more information at that moment, I recommend that you just unmute and say something. That might be the best way for me to hear you. Otherwise, I'm glad to take questions at the end. So thank you so much for having me and for listening early in the morning and what I know is a strange time. So thanks for showing up and being present with this work and with these questions that I will pose to all of you. Now we're going to do the tech moment where I make sure that everything is happening as it should. I'm going to share my screen and ask for, okay, welcome to my talk. The body is medium, accessing complexity somatically via performance, sculpture, and drawing. Thank you again, Allie and TCNJ, for inviting me here today to speak about my work. As Allie said, I am a multidisciplinary, community-focused artist. For this reason, much of what I make is responsive to the needs of my community. I know community means a lot of different things to different people. My community means New Orleans, where I lived for 13 years, which I'll focus the beginning of my talk on, as well as other geographical communities. Within these places, I speak to various intersectional communities there. My artistic community, my activist community, my musical community, my spiritual community, my neighbors, my predecessors, fellow performers, etc. Listening to and working with community needs often spur difficult conversations about systemic issues and their horrifying repercussions. With that in mind, I want to preface my lecture with the warning that I'll be talking about death and drug use, and there are some images with partial nudity as well as staged stock footage of drug use. I'll do my best to alert you to these slides in advance. The image you see here on the screen is from a public grief ceremony and procession I held in New Orleans called Echo the Dead. This event was held around this time of year when most cultures around the world believe the veil is thinnest between the world of our ancestors and the world of the living. This procession and ceremony was an opportunity for people in New Orleans to create intentional space to grieve in the wake of devastation there. of a variety of forms that's fairly continual. Here are some more examples of community-specific second lines and memorials within my community, including for friends of mine who have passed. In these 3 images, you can see altars that I built to invite collaboration with my fellow mourners. People brought objects, photographs, decorations, and ways to participate in the procession itself. While I had a site-specific and social practice in New Orleans, my performance work also extended to include writing narratives for new utopias and criticizing contemporary modes of dialogue. I frequently performed in site-specific non-traditional venues for my performance too, around New Orleans. These are photos from a series of performances with Ruth Michelle in the New Orleans Public Library, the New Orleans Historical Wax Museum, and the steps of the New Orleans Museum of Art. These pieces were an opportunity to look at buried histories within the city, as well as explorations into the alienation of modernity and the difficulty of connection presented in our hyper-mediated world. In 2009, a few friends and myself founded a theater collective called Crunchtown, which has grown exponentially through the years. Crunchtown is a non-hierarchical theater collective based in New Orleans. For a decade, we've created shows at lightning speed with little money. The shows are produced from beginning to end in a month, which includes even deciding what, where, and how we're performing. Each piece showcases the brilliant talents of everyday New Orleanians, with ensembles encompassing around 75 amateurs and professionals. We've pulled off amazing feats as a collective that value accountability, mutual respect, deep care, high intensity, and absurd creativity. Any money that we make at the door with our very affordable ticket prices pays back the little we've spent on the production, and the proceeds are all donated to local organizations doing the on-the-ground social justice work our shows seek to highlight, such as organizations as Take 'em Down NOLA, which work to take down a lot of the racist monuments in New Orleans, the Queer Youth Ensemble, Women with a Vision, Familias Unidas, etc. Here are a few of the examples of plays that we've overhauled and performed. Cops for Crops was a rewriting of The Wicker Man. Murat Saad, the famous play about the French Revolution, and Return to Oz, which was a sequel to Return to Oz. To talk about Return to Oz for a moment, in keeping with our desire to showcase performance in spaces of liminality, for instance, with that show, we staged it in and around an auto body shop that would become an art space, which is a complicated site of gentrification via institutionally legitimized culture. The complication I referred to really extends to our questioning as artists about how we are complicit in the transformation of urban areas, and what we deem as institutionally culture. When we adapt works for Crunchtown, we completely overhaul the narrative to reflect our queer New Orleans ethic and ideals, and to explore problematic aspects of the original text. So, for instance, again, with this show, we didn't want to conceal or celebrate L. Frank Baum, the author's disavowal of Indigenous people. So we made the Stone King the play's hero, as opposed to his original written narrative role as the foe. We made these narrative changes and wrote about them with explanations in the program. So there was a lot of transparency with the audience about the reasons why we changed them and what was changed specifically. I adapted the script, directed, produced, cast, built sets for, and performed in this show, along with a lot of other people. The proceeds from this performance went to women fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline and an Indigenous matriarch within our community. This year, I returned to New Orleans to put on the final Crunchtown for a production of the play The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. Dolly Parton made an amazing original movie, but we wanted this script, narrative, and performance to be led by local sex workers whom we invited to collaborate. Our cast was nearly entirely queer, femme, and non-binary, as a cast of 60 made up of sex workers, activists, policy workers, librarians, teachers, and artists. We raised over $5,000 in ticket and bar sales, which was given to Loud, New Orleans Queer Youth Theater, and Trans Queer Youth NOLA, both providing safe and creative space for trans youth who have been all but criminalized in Louisiana. And specifically, a lot of that legislation was going through the week of our show. We also established the Chicken Ranch Mutual Aid Fund. As I said, we have often built Crunchtown in places experiencing a seismic shift in the city. This time around, we performed in a defunct Family Dollar in the lower Ninth Ward on its way to becoming a harm reduction space. As you know, the lower Ninth Ward was hard hit by Katrina, and Family Dollars and family and dollar stores in general tend to be quite predatory in their neighborhoods. So there was something pretty utopian about watching this predatory store become a community space and being able to inaugurate that transition with a radical performance was very special. My solo work has focused on adorning the body for public space, for performance, for ceremony, as well as for my drawings, which I'll get to in a minute. Here are some examples of inhabited sculptures I've sewn about the merging of identities in New Orleans masquerade culture, including my own heritage, which is Slavic and Jewish, and it's interweaving with Venetian, French, Caribbean, and Yoruban traditions of masquerade that live in that city. I've been particularly interested in the traditional masking of brides and the commodification of the body as gifted in adornment, juxtaposed with the powerful anonymity and enigmatic qualities of being an unidentified figure. The work examines the notion of inhabiting other personas and lives as a way to confront power and power dynamics by undermining existing hierarchies, much in the way masquerade culture in New Orleans functions. These drawings of queer femmes are from a series I call Pattern Porn, where I play with dual notions of fetish, of objects, and of the body. I continue the theme of masked brides by surrounding these bodies by almost a dowry of objects and installations I built, photographed, and drew from. After the pandemic hit in 2020, I moved across the country to be in grad school without any community, mostly interfacing with new people through the computer screen, as we're doing now. In this time, I turned the gaze on myself and made my first self-portrait. I was thinking about the way we hold grief and the past in our bodies and are burdened by them. I was also thinking about the legacies of wandering and moving within my own genealogy and how this epigenetic imprint sometimes feels like a curse. So much of my work has been exceedingly collaborative since I was a teenager, which was 20 years ago, from theater to music to publications. Coming to grad school during a pandemic, I was really curious what my art might be. I've been so confronted with grief, not only from the pandemic, police violence, or political turmoil, but also compounded by the fact that many of my friends have passed away over the past decade from violence and substance use and mental health issues and other issues often related to transients and marginal communities. In graduate school at RISD, I reoriented my practice to make performative objects that investigate the motions of emotion. And these objects could be activated or interacted with when I wasn't present. First, I wanted to build a release for myself and for others in a time we couldn't touch, in a moment of sterility, taking into account how scary it is to face that pain and let it go. I made this steel armature in the fall of 2020 called Practicing Grief. A hard object, difficult to mount, takes balance to lie on, but when you relax into it, is incredibly releasing. Breaks up the pain from carrying burdens and sadness. I find that the ways people relate to it also speaks to ways one steps into difficult spaces of healing. Some kicking it, trying to jump onto it, not trusting it. Others dancing upon it, lying there for long periods of time, crying. This is a short video of my friend and fellow artist Ariana Palat participating with the object through improvised performance and her words in response to that interaction.
I know that this is conformed to your body specifically, and you kind of presenting this object to me and allowing me to be, I guess, like, in a weird way, like, kind of affectionate and intimate with this object as well. That puts you, like, this is a replacement of your body, of your physical body. And since we aren't really allowed to be close and intimate with our friends, I can be with this object, and through that, it's like a visceral connection that to you.
Practicing Grief, that sculpture I just showed you, demanded to be taken outside and made permanent. Reckoning Place is a sculpture I was commissioned to build in 2021 on the campus of Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts, as a new iteration of that previous sculpture. As an artist who's lost considerable friends nationally to the overdose epidemic and who has somewhat recently relocated to so-called New England, I witnessed the staggering correlation between the number of deaths due to overdoses and the architecture of abandoned industry that makes up so much of the landscape here. I wanted to create a meditative support structure out of this visual language. Many studies now demonstrate how American unemployment, created by free trade and the global economy, directly spurred a renewed reliance on controlled substances as coping mechanisms in working class towns. These studies also investigate how the association between trade-related job losses and opioid-related overdose deaths changed when fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid I'm sure you hear about a lot in the news, is present in the local heroin supply. Towers of loss already pepper our landscape. The antiquated mills and industrial homes of specialized craft across so-called New England are now sites of gentrification. No work opportunities remain in these buildings, and few trade or craft workers are affordable to live there. The immense steel structures that once supported an industrial need now rust in overgrown spaces, too expensive to remove. Where are the public's places of reckoning to address the failures of capitalism and to grieve all its effects? How can we turn symbols of death into a practice of life? How are these monuments to overwhelming existentialism related to the reasons people use quieting substances? And how are those same abandoned monuments used as havens for people to use substances who have been rejected from other public spaces? How has this architecture been reclaimed as a marginal space by people who use drugs? All of these were questions that I asked in making this piece. And here's the view from lying on it. Drug use is so rooted in finding a stand-in or surrogate for comfort. Our society doesn't create spaces for collective joy and grief. They're often hard to find or only offered in exchange for capital. I am an artist, but I'm also an activist. I research and I get involved with the issues that I center my work around. I'm going to speak about some of that work, specifically around overdose and harm reduction, and then return to talk a little bit more about my art practice around performance and sculpture that really came out of this research to sort of show both the correlation and how I interweave these different aspects of myself. More young people died of overdoses in 2020 than from COVID, and those numbers continue to rise. Has our society restructured around it? Have institutions extended the same urgency to harm reduction as they had to the pandemic? Sociophysiologists have studied the correlation between chemical responses from an infant's cries of anxiety to the soothing of a caregiver in relation to the experiences of opioid withdrawal and the subsequent opioid use in the human body. People are looking for comfort and care, but as a society, we often make it really difficult to access. And then we criminalize a synthetic substitute for the two. Capitalism strips individuals of community by design. Modern technology alienates people from modes of production directly related to survival and beauty. We've been taught to buy disposable care and simulacrums of connectivity. So why would it surprise anyone that humans have also sought in chemical stand-ins for comfort? Why stigmatize someone who uses drugs into further enclaves of isolation, which is what often leads to death? Here are a couple memes that I've come across that I've really liked. The one on the left, mimicking the ways appropriated language doesn't always necessarily imply that harm is being reduced. And the right example being an excellent example of what real harm reduction looks like. That here's this walrus, everyone's frustrated that he's sinking these boats when he really just wants something to sit on, and so someone made a couch for him. In the light of Wally the Walrus, I asked, have our institutions trained us to use Narcan? And a few states have recently passed legislation to allow for the construction of harm reduction centers. The reality is that safe consumption sites have been existing all over the country for a long time, but they are legal and secret due to the criminalization of controlled substance use. Truth be told, this very exciting political shift is only due to the rising population of often young white opioid users. Every peer-reviewed medical journal is finally printing what the Young Lords and Black Panthers have been publishing since 1970. Communities have been decimated by drug policy and over-policing for decades. We're 50 years overdue for a simple solution that already exists in other countries, epidemic via decriminalization and expanded resources. For 2 years, I worked with the Center for Complexity at RISD on the design of a harm reduction center. That's me right here. My work meant facilitating difficult conversations between people on all ends of the spectrum with regards to drug use. That includes law enforcement, people who use substances, politicians, social workers, pharmacists, and everyone in between, in order to tease out some future vision of how to end the overdose crisis. But people who use drugs have already created harm reduction centers by providing space and support and Narcan in settings deemed illegitimate. Harm reduction is about finding a compassionate alternative to dangerous possibilities, is about creating comfort and understanding where there is none to ultimately make everyone safer. As I forewarned earlier, the next slide contains stock imagery of people using drugs. These were all staged, but they still might be triggering to some people, so I wanted to let you know in advance. Here are some stock images that pop up when one searches for drugs or drug use or drug photos. In 2021, I was awarded the Maharam Fellowship to research new ways of depicting drug use with Transform International. Transform is a desk-based research organization in the UK focusing on the catastrophic effect drug policies have on communities. Transform's educational literature and videos seek to bring attention to the harm that drug policy causes, maintaining that drugs are a health issue, not a criminal issue. The organization seeks to protect children through tighter regulations around drugs and an end to the criminalization of users. Transform, like so many other progressive institutions, relies heavily on stock imagery to illustrate their points, which often reinforces particular stigmas around drug use, as you can see here. My proposal for the fellowship was to experiment with new forms of representation that call the initial images into question and point to the larger systemic issues at play. Once again, my work brought me back to the body, to the human form. Each one of the bodies depicted here is twisted, curled up, or unresponsive. How does the depiction of the body shift our perception around drug use? Drug users are consistently depicted as shadowy and desperate. The depressed and helpless drug user is often white, reflecting a new generation of overdose fatalities that really spurred a national critique, but not the systemic failures that have hit Black and Brown communities for so many decades. Desperation, shame, homelessness, death, these aren't actually the symptoms of drug use. They're the symptoms of a society that criminalizes drug use. When the visuals of drug use reflect society's stigma and place the blame on the user as opposed to the system, education around overdoses can't progress. The addiction and drug fatality problems are systemic, not personal. And so for this work with Transform, I did a simple cut and paste of the stark black and white photos of someone being arrested in grimy shadows amongst graffiti that they used in their briefing. And I interwove it with a color photograph of volunteers testing the validity of drugs at a festival and checking if there was fentanyl in them. I wanted to very simply depict compassionate alternatives to overdose or criminalization that are already taking place so we can encourage a more widespread application of harm reduction practices and kind of show what the real world of harm reduction and drug use looks like. Not everyone at the festival is using drugs. A lot of people are, but they're also not in a shadowy back alley. They're at a festival that they bought tickets to. One of the ways I process information is through doodling. While sitting in on meetings with Transform and with Center for Complexity, I would often illustrate some of my ideas. Here's one conception I have about how we mitigate harm in all facets of our lives already and how compatible they are with the same principles of harm reduction. I thought about the ways we use sharp objects and dangerous hand tools and how they can be applied to dangerous drugs in the same way. I noticed that for my very quick sketches to get a point across were almost childlike, with bodies resembling shapeless forms, almost like a toy. So here I talk about, do we dull a blade to make a knife less dangerous? No, we sharpen it, but we teach someone how to use it. When someone's using sharp tools, we protect ourselves from physical injury. We're trained. We have a medical expert on call. There's usually a phone nearby, stock first aid kit, and people often work in teams. And so I realized how such simple illustration is often the most neutral and effective way to start shifting views about community care, even if I don't always find it very aesthetically attractive. So here's more quick sketches of, okay, how do we do the same thing with harm reduction? We use fentanyl test strips, full spectrum drug testing. We have naloxone, alcohol swabs, safe injection sites. It's a similar thing where we have the tools and the training and the kits and the expertise nearby to prevent dangerous outcomes. I continued the sense of play in my work to consider how shapes that don't denote race, size, gender, or age could transfer a different sort of bias, built upon a parent's or institution support for recreation and harm reduction in moments of celebration instead of prohibiting it and leading to secretive drug use, which often results in overdose. I like to imagine a world where an active, concerned parent talks to their children about condoms, urges them not to drink and drive, and gives them fentanyl test strips. 1 in 4 children report using drugs. Just Say No has not limited the death toll, and abstinence has had a 90% failure rate. So here I just cut up some of the images that I used of people partying, of people, of harm reduction sites at parties, and kind of made that into the shapeless bodies of the people that I was trying to depict. So now we'll go back to my sculptural and performance practice as it deeply relates to everything I just talked about. For this piece entitled Make Yourself Comfortable, it's a video, it's a little blurred here, but I'll play it in a second. I sewed out of silk, stuffed from discarded couches and more stuffing that I could find in the small state of Rhode Island. My attempt was to create a body-like or multi-body form that it was inviting for release, a giant pillow, but weighed me down instead of propping me up. For months before this performance, I've been noticing that the songs I had in my head were really unhealthy models of connection and love. And so I started recording all the songs when they entered my mind. For this performance, I walked for 3 hours in December in this abandoned IBM facility, referencing the loss of industrialized jobs in Kingston, New York, where I now live, and singing the songs in my head as they arrived while trying to carry this 65-pound soft object, which really constricts the throat. What is often societally lacking for people who use drugs is exactly what they're seeking. And so I tried to look at why it's become stigmatized to offer comfort to people who use drugs, and also the burden of carrying grief for the people we've lost. And so thinking about this social function of the armature once again, as I did with practicing grief, but here I'm carrying the armature.
Accept my submission. Oh, please. Darling, I surrender. Ooh, yeah. Darling, I surrender. Yeah. Darling, I surrender. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Some fun YouTube images came up. Okay. So what are the modes of escape we rely on when we're left in this dizzying state of existential crisis? What happens to people when basic needs of food or shelter or connection are denied? In a society focused on recovery instead of understanding, where does even someone put their sober anxieties? And how can we quiet the mind without intoxicants when invisible forces of bureaucracy seem to far outweigh tangible solutions? So here are some memes that popped up on the right, and then on the left, an actual article from The Guardian. I think that really speaks to some of this existential crisis that we have in our world. So I started to think about this anxiety and where do we put the residues of our pain? Were the physical markers for something invisible, like working through it? I built this chair, the original on the left, from sheet metal, and discarded leather from a local factory for a performance in November 2021, where I worried the chair back and forth, unlike a normal rocking chair that goes front to back. I worried this back and forth until the bottom flattened out and the paint cracked, and I actually got kind of stuck in the chair. The chair lost its original function and modernist shape through this process of serving the function of being worried. What remains is a relic of working through it. So it becomes sort of this like reliquary, this relic object of an experience without being a chair anymore or a functional chair. So I continue to explore these notions of holding and of the spaces I've sat in and others have hidden in, provided the ones I've provided for others and the trauma that might reside in those holding places. And I kept being confronted with the assigned woman's body as a site for grief and care, an armature of pain and of healing. In Michelangelo's Pietà, for example, Mary is a chair. Her body actually was newly aligned by the sculpture into one of an armature, out of bodily proportion to what is physically possible and concealed by excessive drapery. In Pietà, Mary holds presence and absence. She holds life and death, human and deity. The existence and impression in the spaces I've created feels more like an apparition than a protagonist, an attempt to move like the ghosts I know. How do ghosts sit? How do we trace impressions of air and build altars of comfort to spirits? What kind of work is required to build a space that contains loss? I'm particularly engrossed in the now rare practice of furniture making because this is where I can see handiwork of an individual, not produced or assembled en masse, but built slowly, repaired, and redressed for different times. For this piece, I continue to think about armatures and the way that they're built to hold the body and allow for rest and contemplation while being a body in itself. And looking at a chair without a body as a mark of absence. A permanently empty chair loses function. And a chair that you're not allowed to sit in is already a site of grief. So I took apart an old chair. I created my impression within it through concrete on foam. And then I made a separate sculpture of that impression and then created this projection triptych on top of the sculpture to look at this process of creating absence and essentially the relic of what was held before. This isn't, there we go. Reliquaries are, I'm curious what image was between them because I don't think there was a video there. Reliquaries are conceptual cabinets of curiosity, thinking of the relic in the past piece that I referred to. They're dizzyingly ornate to conjure divine wholeness via tibia or carpal. The delicately gilded case and cloak are nothing in comparison to the salvation of finding heaven through faith alone, which they promised. The space contained is that of belief, an horrified suspension of cruel criticism, an elevation of the human to the divine, an earthly representation of ascension. So how do we take the torture inflicted for piety of the ignoble and turn it into a blessing of forgiveness? As I think about grief, I think about my own life and my childhood. And what we learn about death, we learn first from our families. My first funerals reflected both sides of my family. The sensuous and awe-provoking elements of the Catholicism practiced by the Zibby Jahns side on my dad's side, and the minimalist, heady Jewish ceremonies on the Metcalf side, my mom's. While I was not raised Catholic and was often reminded as my sisters and I remained seated in the pews during communion for family events that our family was different, I appreciated passing into this space of mystery, of echo, of smells on the west side of Chicago. When I came to mourn the passing of my grandmother, aunt, uncles, cousins, I was honored to act as a pallbearer and be invited to read lines of scripture to the congregation that were unfamiliar to me. It didn't feel like mine at the moment, but I wanted to be connected to the lineage of worship that half of my family followed. And I asked, did my grandma practice these same traditions before she came to America when she emigrated from Slovakia? How long had this opulence been a part of their worship? When had the traditions of Slavic paganism slipped away into Catholicism? And how had my family exchanged some of those traditions for a promise of whiteness in America? This piece I made in 2022 from bronze and antique metal trim, Swarovski crystals, silk, steel, concrete, foam, and salt. And my last slide, this is an installation I built a year ago from discarded rocking chairs at the World's Fair Gallery in Providence, Rhode Island. In my own Jewish tradition, we sit Shiva for the dead. When grave news is being delivered, we encourage the recipient of the message to take a seat. We rely on the emotional and physical spaces of holding heavily in hard times. I look to the organic shapes my grandpa crafted with the lathe from driftwood, the rocking chair my mom sat in to take late night phone calls. I'd curl up in her lap and press my head against her chest, hear the vibrations in her ribs, muffled and loud. I continue to be intrigued by these armatures built to soothe, to rock a baby to sleep, to support a worn-out mother, to push a breeze on the face in the middle of summer. How do these shapes comfort us when they're inverted? Can we give the armatures some agency, allow them autonomy? What happens when we can't actually sit on them? I have always been guided by Judaism's embrace of questioning as a holy pursuit. I come from a long line of grandfathers who inscribed sacred texts written over millennia. These arguing Talmudic rabbis investigated theoretical possibilities in gray areas that exist in our conception of life. My art practice means waiting and working through the complexity that characterizes this world and the people I love. I've returned to this practice these past 2 weeks as I grieve the genocide of Palestinian people in the name of Jewish trauma. How can we move through ancestral pain and allow for healing? How can we support all who grieve without weaponizing pain? How can we use our own desire for liberation to liberate all people who are oppressed? How can we use our art practice in tandem with our political lives to make space for these questions and the disparate, painful realities we all experience? These questions are ongoing, and they're questions, as is my continual dedication to showing up as an activist. Art can't exist in a vacuum, at least I don't believe so. My art practice often takes a back seat to my desire to first be a person in community. Showing up to defend the lives of innocent people is more important than working in my studio. My goal as an artist is to express some of this nuance and inspire conversation that thoughtfully explores the systemic roots of our grief, meanwhile offering some space for release. So thank you so much for listening to that.